Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for bearing with me as I try to manage all of these controls on Zoom, but we're almost through it, so. But welcome to our Itaikyo Perpetual Memorial Service. And Itaikyo is a tradition that started back in Japan's Edo period, hundreds of years ago. And Itaikyo means to perpetually read the sutras over generations. And so this service is observed in appreciation for those of our ancestors who have made it possible for us to hear the sutras. And we gather with the hope that the Buddha Dharma will be transmitted to future generations. And it not only looks back into the history of our Sangha, but looks ahead to the future generations to be able to hear our chanting today. And at this time of year, I can't help but think of my mother, Kimi Yanari. She passed away suddenly 14 years ago in 2008 and was just after Thanksgiving. And I've been thinking a lot about her because I was searching for a recipe for zucchini bread and I couldn't find her recipe. And I searched the internet for something, but couldn't find anything that looked like what she had made. And then finally, I remembered I had an old recipe box of hers buried back in the corner of a cabinet. And so I pulled it out, and as I was starting to go through it, waves of memories flooded back. She loved to collect recipes from friends and family. And every time she tasted something delicious, she always asked somebody for the recipe. And she kept them in this card file. Some of them were on recipe cards, and some were just tattered pieces of paper. And maybe you're like me, but in recent times, I've moved away from collecting all those recipe cards, and I've been relying more on searching the internet for recipes from maybe the New York Times or the Food Network or some blogger website. Or my favorite one these days is Just One Cookbook. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a wonderful Japanese recipe website. But as I started to sort through all these old recipe cards, I realized all the countless connections in her life and seeing her handwriting with these little notes written on them, where she had marked down where she had had this or who she got the recipe from friends, neighbors, relatives. There were even some from me and from my sisters, and maybe there are recipes there from some of you. These recipe cards are like snapshots, photographs that record the connections to people, occasions, celebrations, wonderful memories of times past. And I recognize the names of people, many who are long gone, but who made an impact on her life. And she happily shared these morsels of deliciousness with us, her family, grandchildren, friends, and maybe she brought some of these dishes to her own Twin Cities Buddhist Sangha gatherings. And so at Itaikyo, that's what this service is supposed to be all about. Realizing that due to the many causes and conditions throughout our life, most meaningful connections we have is to our family and friends, and especially to those people who have lived before us, our parents, grandparents, and others. Without them, we would not exist. Now, I know today we have some new people here on the call that may not be that familiar with the history of the Twin Cities Buddhist Sangha. So I wanted to just share a little bit of history with you so you can all know what has gone on in order to keep the Twin Cities Buddhist Sangha alive. So after World War II, a small community of Japanese settled here in the Twin Cities. Some of them here due to the Military Intelligence Language School at Camp Savage and Fort Snelling. Some coming from the internment camps to resettle here with other family members. And in 1946, Father Dai Kitagawa, who was an Episcopal clergyman who was assigned as a civilian chaplain to the Nisei soldiers, so Nisei being second generation Japanese Americans. So these soldiers were training at Camp Savage. And Father Dai encouraged those Nisei who were Buddhist to form the Twin Cities Buddhist Association. The first service was held at the Minneapolis YWCA, and then thereafter at a Unitarian church on Harmon Place. And it's interesting that the YWCA and the Unitarians play part of our history, as you'll hear later. In 1949, there was a newly created Japanese American Community Center owned by the Episcopal Diocese of Minnesota. The center, as it was called, was a big old mansion and was located at 2200 Blaisdell. We shared the space with some other groups, and we used that space for many years up until 1965. At that time, Reverend Gyodo Kono of the Midwest Buddhist Temple in Chicago traveled monthly to conduct services, and he was a wonderful support to the community for many, many years. When Reverend Kono would come to speak, those services were held Saturday nights, and they were all in Japanese. And as kids, we would sit not so patiently through the long sutra chanting, antsy to be excused before the Japanese Dharma talk began. Dharma school, or Sunday school, as we called it back then, was started in 1950, and my older sister Emmy and Al Ono and his sister Merlene were the first students. And it grew from there. It was started by Reverend Philip Eidman, who was a Buddhist minister and was ordained as a Jodo Shinshu minister. And it was continued with the help of Dr. Ikeda, who was a Buddhist minister, but also a doctor doing his postgraduate work at the University of Minnesota. He returned to Japan in 1958. And here's some photos, courtesy of my Yanari cousins, Tomiuri and Sachi, of a Sunday school class in 1963. I don't know if you recognize any people there. This is my oldest sister, Emmy. Here's Frank Suchia. I don't know if he's on the call. And here's my brother, Dean, I think. And this is me with my head turned. And my sister, Toyo, cousin Tomi, and a cousin Yuri. Here's Susie Suchia. So that's Reverend Todd and Frank's sister. And here we have Reverend Todd. So cute. And Rick, I think you're on the call. I think this is Rick. And I think this is your sister, Patty. And I don't know, the whole Sada family is in there. So it's hard to believe that that picture was taken over 58 years ago. Here we have some more pictures from Hanamatsuri plays from back in the day. But the center was a hub of much of the social interaction of the Japanese community. And I have fond memories of attending Sunday school there every Sunday. The Hanamatsuri plays in the basement, bazaars held on the front lawn with shaved ice and carnival games, Halloween parties. It was a gathering place for the entire Japanese community, and there was lots of sharing of wonderful Japanese food. Unfortunately, the building was sold and torn down, and so the group was in search of a meeting place for monthly services and for Dharma school. But through the kindness of the Unitarians, we eventually were able to meet at the First Universalist Church on 5000 Girard Avenue in Minneapolis, and we were able to continue Sunday evening services there. Eventually, we followed the Unitarians when they moved to their new home at 3400 DuPont. For the Dharma school, my dad helped to find a new place for us to meet on Sundays, and we met in several interesting places. For a short time, We met at an art theater, which I remember there was some inappropriate art hanging, and so they had to cover it up before we had service. But then we started to meet at the Red Carpet Beauty School, chanting the sutras under the hair dryers. And it was a very unusual space with fluorescent orange and green walls, mannequin heads and curlers. But we felt lucky to be able to have a place to gather. When they tore that school down for the building of the Nicollet Mall, Dad was on the search again to find another place, and he was able to secure the Minneapolis Business School on 10th Street in Minneapolis. But the Dharma School continued running, holding Hanamatsuri plays every April on Buddha's birthday. You see some of the pictures, and I know it's hard to see, but maybe you'll recognize some of the faces. Here's Kevin Kosobayashi and my sister Toil playing. And some of the Dharma School classes, I don't know if you can recognize some of the people, but I think that's Kim and Lynn and Lori and Todd with Phyllis. And I think that's Barb. And this picture I had to show because I think Stacy Moore tells me that I traumatized her in her youth by making her be the narrator for the play that year. And while we never had a full-time resident minister or a building of our own, we were so fortunate that various ministers helped us out while they were attending school here or working at the University of Minnesota. And Reverend Ikeda was here from 1958. And then Reverend Yuri Kyogoku from 60 to 63. She was very influential in teaching us about the Buddhist way of life. Reverend Shijung Yakumo from 66 to 68, who ended up marrying my sister Emmy's roommate in college. Reverend Makino was here from 68 to 70, and Reverend Shigefuji from 72 to 73. And through all those years, the Twin Cities Buddhist Association board strived to keep the Sangha going with the spiritual guidance of Shige Tsurasaki. And after the passing of Reverend Kono in 1975, Reverend Ron Miyamura of the Midwest Buddhist Temple in Chicago began coming to the Twin Cities, and he has continued his support, been our constant champion and advisor and spiritual leader. He would visit us 7 times a year. And next year will be Reverend Ron's 50th year in supporting our Sangha. We're so very, very grateful for his help and guidance. I know this is really hard to see, but as the children grew up, the Dharma school waned for a bit, but as my generation, Sansei, or third generation, as we began to have children, us moms started up the Dharma school again in the 80s. And when it became harder to utilize the space for the First Universalist Church, we rotated hosting in our homes. There are a few of us that lived in Eden Prairie, and so it was convenient for us to rotate from home to home. So here you see my sister Toil and her son Martin, myself and my son Jason, and this is Alyssa hiding here. We have Phyllis Kimmich and Mieko and Benjamin, and then Jan Nishimura and her daughter Laura. Jan was the superintendent of Sunday school for many years. And then we came full circle back to the YWCA. Through Joyce Yamamoto, we were able to use the YWCA location on Lake Street for many, many years. And they allowed us to rent rooms there on Sundays. But with the revival of COVID And with the murder of George Floyd, everything in Minneapolis shut down. But through the magic of Zoom, the Twin Cities Buddhist Sangha has continued to thrive and even grown. And with the support of all of you, we've expanded our services from 6 times a year to 12 times a year. And now we've expanded to twice a month, 24 services a year. And so here we are today. You know, it's pretty amazing with no permanent building, no resident minister. We still exist, 76 years, representing 5 generations. But as we look at these photos, we owe our gratitude and appreciation to all those Issei and Nisei and Sansei, and for all the senseis who looked out for us, nurtured us, brought us the Buddha Dharma, brought the Buddha Dharma to us over all these 76 years so that we can exist today. If you do the mathematics on our ancestors, for us to be born today from 12 previous generations, each one of us needed a total of 4,094 ancestors over the last 400 years in order for us to exist. Think about all the struggles our ancestors went through just for us to be here today. And just think about all our past Sangha members and the struggles they went through. You know, thinking about their lives, making the difficult decision to journey to America to find new opportunities, living through the difficult times of discrimination and hate, and working hard to establish a new way of living in this strange country. And then the difficult internment camp years for the Japanese, the displacement they went through, being forced to leave their homes and all their possessions on the West Coast, and then having to resettle here in this Minnesota tundra, away from their large Japanese community support. But they knew the importance of keeping the Dharma alive for themselves and for their families, and they banded together to support the Twin Cities Buddhist Sangha. Now think about how much our ancestors have had to go through in order for us to exist at this very present moment. I am always moved by the reading of the 3 treasures, and it resonates so true. Hard is it to be born into human life, and now we are living it. Difficult it is to hear the teachings, yet now we hear them. Think about how difficult the past has been for the Issei and Issei. The Dharma, the Nembutsu, is a teaching that gave the people of our past the strength to live their lives. It's also what gave them hope for the future that we are all now a part of. And how humbling it is to realize that the sutras we chant are the same words spoken by our ancestors from hundreds of years ago. We are reminded to appreciate the gifts from our past by remembering and honoring all of those who made the Nembutsu a part of their lives and honor their wishes to share the Dharma with the future. At this Itaikyo service, it's time for us to say thank you and acknowledge that our lives have been supported by the efforts of others. Now, the roots of Jodo Shinshu come from ancestors from Japan, but is spread beyond our ethnic community. The message of the Buddha Dharma is available to everyone, as displayed by the diversity of all of you. Some of you have been with us for many, many years. Some have recently found us. Some of you are coming from other religious traditions, some from other temples, some returning to us from long ago. We have people joining us from Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, New Mexico, California, and now even Bemidji. And we're finding new ways to share the Buddha's teachings. And just think, without Zoom, could we even exist? Shinran Shonin wrote in his writings on teaching, practice, faith, and enlightenment. Those who have been born first guide those who come later. And those who are born later join those who were born before. On this Itaikyo service, we gratefully look back and gratefully look forward to all of you. Grateful to you for joining us in helping to perpetuate the Dharma and keeping the reading of the sutras going. Itaikyo is an opportunity to gasho and recite the Nembutsu and express our gratitude to ancestors past and present for the efforts to connect us. It's a time we can affirm our own understanding of Buddhism because of the guidance of the Buddha through our loved ones. And by acknowledging our Dharma connection to those who have passed away, it empowers us to further pursue this endless path that unfolds before us through the working of Amita's name. And also, on this Thanksgiving, I hope you can share some favorite recipes and pass on memories and celebrate for future generations. So please join me in Gasho. Namo Amidam. Namo Amidam. Namo Amidam. Namo Amidam. Namo Amidam.